That is what happened in the South China Sea in the past 72 hours. The USS Carl Vinson carrier strike group, operating under standing orders to conduct a freedom of navigation transit through international waters that the United States Navy has transited without serious challenge for 7 decades, was intercepted at the outer boundary of China's declared exclusion zone by a People's Liberation Army Navy Surface Action Group of 14 vessels, 2 Type 055 guided missile destroyers, 6 Type 052D destroyers, 4 Type 054A frigates, and 2 Type 901 fast combat support ships positioned in a blocking formation across the carrier group's intended transit corridor. The intercept was not aggressive in the kinetic sense, no weapons were fired, no targeting radars were illuminated in the manner that constitutes a hostile act under the rules of engagement that govern American naval operations. What happened was more sophisticated and more consequential than a shot fired across the bow. The PA Land Surface Action Group simply occupied the water, 14 warships, in a formation that left the Carl Vinson's commander with a choice that his orders had not anticipated, and that his chain of command from 7th Fleet to Pacific Fleet to the Pentagon to the National Security Council spent the next 18 hours debating without reaching a conclusion that anyone was prepared to execute. The Carl Vinson did not transit. It is holding position at the boundary of the exclusion zone, while Washington debates options that all carry costs nobody in the current political environment is prepared to pay. And while that debate continues, the Middle East is simultaneously consuming every available American military asset, every available diplomatic bandwidth, every available unit of political attention that the executive branch possesses. America is facing 2 simultaneous crises in 2 separate oceans, and the operational and strategic resources required to manage both do not exist in the quantities the situation demands. That is not an analytical judgment. It is a mathematical reality visible in the force deployment data, the logistics picture, and the command attention bandwidths of an institution that was not designed to fight at this scale in 2 theatres simultaneously. Tonight I want to work through 4 questions that define what the next 72 hours look like and what they mean for the decade that follows. First, how did China execute this intercept with a legal and operational precision that has left Washington without a clean response option? And what does the specific composition of the blocking force reveal about how long Beijing has been planning for exactly this moment? Second, what does the 2 ocean crisis actually look like in operational terms? The carrier groups, the logistics chains, the command attention, the munitions inventories, and why the gap between American commitments and American capacity has never been more dangerously visible than it is right now. Third, why is China doing this now? What is the relationship between the timing of this intercept and the specific phase of the Middle East conflict? And what does that relationship reveal about the degree of strategic coordination between Beijing and Moscow that American intelligence has consistently underestimated? When the Carl Vinson either transits or turns back, what does each outcome mean for the alliance architecture that American primacy in the Pacific has depended on for 70 years? And which capitals are watching this moment with the most consequential attention? Stay with me through this complete breakdown, because the answers to these questions will define the strategic environment that every nation on Earth navigates for the next generation. If this channel delivers the analysis you cannot find in the mainstream coverage, subscribe now and share this with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening beneath the diplomatic language and the official statements. Hit like and leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them. Now let us work through this completely. The legal architecture of what China executed in the past 72 hours deserves careful analysis, because it is the most operationally sophisticated element of the entire intercept and the one that has left Washington most thoroughly without a clean response. China did not fire on an American vessel. China did not illuminate the Carl Vinson strike group with fire control radar. China did not issue a formal warning that constitutes a hostile act under the definitions that American rules of engagement recognize. What China did was position 14 warships in international waters that China claims as its exclusive economic zone under an interpretation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that the United States rejects. The Permanent Court of Arbitration rejected in its 2016 ruling, and virtually every American treaty ally in the Pacific rejects. But rejection of the legal claim and the operational reality of 14 warships in a blocking formation are two entirely different things. The Type 055 guided missile destroyers that anchor the Plian blocking formation are not symbolic assets. The Type 055 is the most capable surface combatant currently deployed by any navy in the world in terms of vertical launch system capacity. Long, each Type 055 carries 112 vertical launch cells capable of housing the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, the HHQ-9B long-range surface-to-air missile, and the CJ-10 land attack cruise missile in any combination that mission planning requires. Two of them in a blocking formation represent a defensive and offensive envelope that any carrier strike group commander has to account for before he decides to push through. The 6 Type 052D destroyers that complete the surface action group's core add another 64 vertical launch cells per vessel. The mathematics of the engagement envelope that the blocking formation represents are not comfortable for the Carl Vinson's air wing planners, and they were not designed to be. This formation was not assembled in 72 hours. The logistical coordination, the communication protocols, the rules of engagement under which 14 PLN vessels are operating in a synchronized blocking formation reflect planning that was conducted over months and exercised repeatedly until the execution was smooth enough to deploy in a situation where any error could produce kinetic incident that neither side can fully control once it begins. The fast combat support ships, the Type 901 vessels that complete the formation, are the detail that tells you most about the duration of planning behind this deployment. Combat support ships are not combat vessels. They are the logistics backbone that allows a surface action group to sustain its position indefinitely without returning to port for fuel and provisions. Their inclusion in the blocking formation is China's way of saying that this is not a demonstration that will conclude in 48 hours when the fuel runs low. This is a sustained operational posture that Beijing is prepared to maintain for as long as the political and strategic situation requires. Washington's response has been constrained by the same legal complexity that China's planners designed into the operation. The United States' position on freedom of navigation in the South China Sea rests on the argument that the waters China claims as its exclusive economic zone are international waters under the law of the sea, through which naval vessels of all nations have the right of innocent passage. That argument is legally sound, internationally supported, and operationally irrelevant when 14 warships are physically occupying the transit corridor. The American response options range from pushing through the formation, which risks a collision or an incident that escalates beyond anyone's ability to manage, to holding position and continuing to debate, which is what is happening now, to turning back, which is the outcome that China's planners designed this operation to produce, and which carries strategic consequences that dwarf the tactical situation at the exclusion zone boundary. The debate in Washington is real, and it is genuinely difficult because none of the available options is clean, and that difficulty, that absence of a response that satisfies the strategic requirement without carrying unacceptable risk, is precisely what China's operational planners were designing for when they built this intercept. Let me turn to the two-ocean dimension because it is the variable that transforms a serious bilateral confrontation in the South China Sea into a strategic crisis of a different order entirely. The United States Navy operates 11 carrier strike groups. That number sounds large until you account for the operational reality of how those groups are actually distributed at any given moment. Carriers require maintenance cycles. The Nimitz-class vessels that constitute the majority of the fleet are operating on maintenance schedules that reflect decades of continuous deployment tempo. At any given time, approximately 4 to 5 carrier strike groups are operationally available for immediate deployment. The remainder are in various stages of maintenance, workup, and training cycles that cannot be compressed without accepting unacceptable degradation in readiness. The Middle East situation has already consumed the operational availability of 3 carrier strike groups: the Gerald R. Ford, the Dwight the 500th, Eisenhower, and the Harry S. Truman are committed to the Arabian Sea and Eastern Mediterranean operational areas in a posture that reflects the scale of the military confrontation currently underway with Iranian forces and their aligned partners. Their redeployment to the Pacific to reinforce the Carl Vinson is not a planning option that can be executed on a timeline relevant to the current South China Sea situation. The Carl Vinson is what America has in the Western Pacific right now at the level of carrier aviation, and the Carl Vinson is holding position at the edge of a blocking formation. It has not been authorized to push through. The logistics dimension compounds the force availability problem in ways that the public commentary has almost entirely missed. Carrier aviation depends on a continuous supply chain of aviation fuel, ordnance, spare parts, and maintenance support that flows through forward operating bases and logistics nodes distributed across the Pacific. The forward basing infrastructure that supports American naval operations in the Western Pacific, the facilities in Japan, Guam, and the Philippines, was designed for a threat environment that assumed America would be managing one major contingency at a time, not 2 simultaneous crises in separate oceans, with the full operational intensity that both currently demand. The munitions logistics picture is where the 2-ocean crisis becomes most immediately acute. Standard missiles, the SM-2, SM-3, and SM-6 variants that constitute the primary air defense interceptor inventory of American surface combatants, are being consumed in the Middle East at rates that the production base was not calibrated to replace on the timelines the operational situation requires. The same industrial constraints that are creating Tamir interceptor shortfalls in Israeli air defense systems are creating SM inventory pressure across American surface combatant squadrons. Carrier strike group that deploys to a potential high-intensity confrontation in the Western Pacific, while its sister groups are consuming interceptors at sustained rates in the Middle East, deploying with a logistics backstop that is thinner than its operational posture requires. The command attention dimension is the one that defense analysts discuss least frequently, and that matters most in practice. The American military command structure, from the Secretary of Defense through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the combatant commanders in Indo-Pacific Command and Central Command, is a human institution with finite bandwidth, managing a sustained high-intensity military confrontation in the Middle East while simultaneously navigating a carrier group standoff in the South China Sea, while simultaneously monitoring the Taiwan Strait for indicators of Chinese military activity, while simultaneously managing the alliance relationships across both theatres, simultaneously consumes command attention at a rate that the institution was not designed to sustain without accepting degradation in the quality of decision-making somewhere in the system. The somewhere in which that degradation appears is not predictable in advance. It appears where the system is most stressed at the moment that the most consequential decision needs to be made, and that is the definition of strategic vulnerability. China's planners understand this. The two-ocean crisis is not a coincidence. It is a design. Now, let me be direct about the timing question, because I think it is the most important analytical dimension of what is happening and the one that the mainstream coverage is most thoroughly avoiding. China did not execute this intercept when the South China Sea situation was the primary focus of American strategic attention. China executed it when American strategic attention, military assets, logistics capacity, and command bandwidth are maximally consumed by the Middle East confrontation. The relationship between those two facts is not coincidental. It is the product of a level of strategic coordination between Beijing and Moscow that the American intelligence community has consistently assessed as shallower than it actually is. The Russia-Iran relationship produced the military capability transfer and operational alignment that created the Middle East crisis in its current form. The Middle East crisis in its current form is what created the window of American strategic distraction and asset commitment that China is exploiting in the South China Sea right now. That is a three-actor coordination problem operating across two theaters simultaneously, and it is the most sophisticated strategic challenge that American grand strategy has faced since the Cold War. The Chinese domestic political context provides the additional dimension that explains why this moment was chosen with the specific operational posture that was deployed. President Xi Jinping has staked the legitimacy of the current leadership's historical position on the eventual resolution of the Taiwan question. The domestic political timeline that the current leadership is managing creates pressure to demonstrate measurable progress toward that resolution within a time frame that the leadership's own political calendar defines. The South China Sea intercept is not the Taiwan operation. It is the demonstration that precedes it, the operational proof of concept that establishes the template, tests the American response, measures the alliance cohesion, and creates the precedent that a Chinese exclusion of American naval access to waters China claims is something that Washington will debate rather than immediately contest. Every day that the Carl Vinson holds position at the exclusion zone boundary, rather than pushing through or being authorized to push through, is a day that the president calcifies. Taiwan's government understands this with a clarity that several of America's other Pacific allies are only beginning to process. The statements from Taipei in the past 48 hours reflect an institution that is watching the Carl Vinson standoff with the specific quality of attention of a government that understands it may be watching the operational rehearsal for the scenario it fears most. Japan and South Korea, the alliance anchors of American Pacific strategy, are conducting their own assessments of what the Carl Vinson standoff means for the reliability of the security guarantees that anchor their own defense postures. The assessment is not comfortable. An American carrier group that can be blocked from transiting international waters by a Chinese surface action group and that holds position for 18 hours while Washington debates options is a carrier group whose deterrent credibility has been operationally tested and found to be conditional in ways that the formal alliance commitments do not acknowledge. The Philippines, which has been steadily deepening its security relationship with the United States over the past 2 years, following a period of closer accommodation with Beijing, is watching the standoff from a position of particular vulnerability. Philippine territorial claims in the South China Sea directly overlap with the waters where the blocking formation is currently positioned. The American failure to push through does not simply affect American credibility in the abstract. It affects the specific operational situation of a treaty ally whose territorial interests are directly engaged by the Chinese exclusion zone, claims that the blocking formation is enforcing. Manila is watching Washington debate and drawing conclusions that will influence Philippine strategic alignment decisions for years. Australia, the most capable American military ally in the Pacific after Japan, has deployed its own naval assets in coordination with American Pacific operations throughout the current period of elevated tension. The Australian strategic debate about the Carl Vinson standoff is happening at the highest levels of government right now, and the question being debated in Canberra is not abstract. It is whether the AUKUS framework and the American alliance commitment it represents provide the operational depth that Australian strategic planning requires in a security environment where China has demonstrated the willingness and the capability to physically exclude American naval assets from disputed waters. The answer that Canberra reaches in the next 72 hours will influence Australian defence investment decisions, force posture choices and alliance management strategy for a generation. Now I want to address the outcomes directly because the Carl Vinson standoff will resolve in one of three ways, and each outcome carries strategic consequences that need to be examined honestly. The first outcome is that Washington authorises the Carl Vinson to push through the blocking formation. This outcome satisfies the freedom of navigation principle and the credibility requirement that the transit represent. It does so by accepting the risk of a collision or an incident in a 14-vessel formation occupying the transit corridor that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. A collision between an American carrier and a Chinese Type 055 destroyer is not a diplomatic incident. It is an event that kills people, destroys expensive equipment, creates domestic political pressure in both Washington and Beijing that constrains the decision space of both governments, and puts two nuclear-armed states on an escalation ladder with no predetermined rung at which either side has committed to stop. The American military professionals who are advising against the push-through option are not advising timidity. They are advising against accepting an escalation risk in the South China Sea, while the Middle East is already consuming maximum operational attention and asset commitment. Their judgment is that the risk-adjusted cost of the push-through option in the current two-ocean environment exceeds the cost of the alternatives. That judgment may be correct, but the strategic cost of the alternatives needs to be assessed with equal honesty. The second outcome is that Washington and Beijing reach a negotiated resolution through back-channel communication that allows the Carl Vinson to complete a modified transit, perhaps on a different route, perhaps with a different operational profile, in exchange for some Chinese concession that neither side publicly acknowledges. This outcome preserves the freedom navigation principle in a technical sense, while establishing in practice that Chinese blocking formations can modify the operational behavior of American carrier strike groups. It is the outcome that both governments' diplomatic establishments are probably working toward right now, because it resolves the immediate tactical situation without producing the kinetic incident that neither side wants. Its strategic cost is the precedent it sets for every future Chinese operational posture in waters it claims. If a blocking formation produces a modified American transit today, a blocking formation tomorrow will produce a further modification, and the cumulative effect of successive modifications is an operational reality in which Chinese exclusion zones are functionally enforced regardless of their legal status. The third outcome is that the Carl Vinson holds position long enough that the political and logistical situation forces a withdrawal to a position outside the exclusion zone boundary. This is the outcome that China's planners designed the operation to produce, and it is the outcome that carries the most immediate and severe consequences for American credibility across the Pacific Alliance system. A carrier group that turns back from a Chinese blocking formation has demonstrated in the most operationally concrete terms available that Chinese sea denial capability can successfully exclude American naval power from waters China claims. That demonstration does not require a shot fired. It requires only a radar track and a navigational record showing that the carrier group changed course at the boundary of the Chinese formation and did not come back. The governments in Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, Manila and Canberra that are watching this standoff in real time will draw their own conclusions from that navigational record, and those conclusions will influence their strategic alignment decisions in ways that no amount of American diplomatic reassurance can fully offset. My honest assessment of where this leads is one that I want to state as directly as I can, because the implications are significant and the mainstream commentary is consistently understating them. The two-ocean crisis that America is managing right now is not a temporary operational difficulty created by an unusual coincidence of simultaneous crises. It is the operational expression of a structural gap between American global commitments and American global capacity that has been building for 2 decades, and that the architecture of American grand strategy has consistently refused to honestly acknowledge. The American military was built for primacy. It was designed on the assumption that American military power would be so overwhelming across every relevant dimension that no regional actor and no combination of regional actors could present a credible simultaneous challenge across multiple theaters. That assumption was the foundation of American alliance commitments from the Persian Gulf to the Taiwan Strait. It was the basis on which partners across both regions calibrated their own defense investments and their own strategic alignment choices. It is no longer operationally valid, and the Carl Vinson standoff is the most visible current demonstration of why China holds the initiative in this moment, not because its military has defeated American military power in a direct engagement, but because it has constructed an operational situation in which every American response option carries costs that the current strategic environment makes prohibitively expensive. That is a more sophisticated form of strategic victory than winning a battle, and it was achieved not through a single operation, but through decades of patient investment in the specific capabilities, the sea denial systems, the anti-access architecture, the logistics depth, and the alliance relationships with Russia and Iran that make the current operational situation possible. In Moscow, the Carl Vinson standoff is being absorbed with the same calibrated satisfaction that has characterized Russian strategic communication throughout the period of maximum American commitment to the Middle East. Russia benefits from every hour of American strategic attention and military asset commitment that the South China Sea consumes, because every such hour is an hour not available for Ukraine, for NATO's eastern flank, for the diplomatic pressure that American primacy once made routinely available. The Russian calculation that deepening the Iran relationship would eventually produce a Middle East crisis capable of absorbing American strategic bandwidth was validated months ago. The Chinese decision to exploit that absorption through the South China Sea intercept validates the broader strategic framework within which Russia, China, and Iran have been operating as a loose but increasingly coordinated axis of revisionist powers. In Beijing, the assessment of the standoff's first 72 hours will focus on American decision-making tempo. 18 hours to reach a non-decision is a data point. The absence of a clear presidential statement establishing a firm operational deadline for resolving the standoff is a data point. The visible gap between public American assertions of freedom of navigation principles and the operational reality of a carrier group holding position at the boundary of a blocking formation is a data point. All of those data points feed into Chinese planning for the scenarios that matter most to Beijing's strategic timeline, and they are feeding into that planning in real time as the Carl Vinson continues to hold.